In the shadows of history, there exist men who believed themselves untouchable, men who walked among the living as gods among mortals, whose word was law, whose breath could end a life, whose gaze could shatter kingdoms. These men built empires on the bones of the innocent, crowned themselves with the tears of widows, and decorated their thrones with the silence of those who dared not speak. This is the story of one such man. A man who ruled with an iron fist so tight that justice itself seemed to bow before him. Courts trembled. Judges whispered his name only in locked chambers. Lawyers burned their cases rather than face his wrath. For decades, he stood above the law, a colossus casting shadows across an entire nation, untouched, unquestioned, unconquerable. No court dared him. No tribunal could reach him. No judge possessed the courage to sign a warrant bearing his name. But there is a court that waits for every man. A court with no chambers, no robes, no gavels. A court whose verdict is written not in ink, but in the inevitable passage of moments. A court where the judge wears no face, carries no bias, and offers no appeals. And time, as we shall see, is the only court that never fails to convene. To understand how a man becomes untouchable, we must first understand where he began. Our subject was not born into royalty, though he would die believing himself a king. He was not born into wealth, though he would amass fortunes that could feed nations. He was born into chaos, into a world bleeding from the wounds of upheaval, where power was the only currency that mattered. The year was 1958. The nation was fracturing. Old regimes crumbled like sandcastles before the tide of revolution. And in that chaos, ambitious men saw opportunity. He was one of them. Young, hungry, with eyes that burned with something darker than ambition. It was hunger for dominance, for absolute control. He joined the movement not out of ideology, but out of instinct. Like a predator sensing wounded prey, he understood that in times of collapse, the ruthless rise fastest. Within months, he had made himself indispensable. Within years, he had made himself feared. By 1963, when the revolution finally devoured its own children and spat out a new order, he stood at its center, not as the face of the regime, but as its fist, the enforcer, the shadow behind the throne who whispered in the ear of power and watched his words become death sentences. Those who knew him in those early days speak of a man devoid of conscience, possessed of a singular talent for reading weakness in others and exploiting it without hesitation. He collected secrets the way other men collect stamps. Every conversation was an interrogation. Every smile concealed a blade. And he was patient. For 7 years, he served in the shadows, consolidating power, building networks of loyalty through fear and favor, positioning his pieces across the board with the precision of a grandmaster. Those who opposed him simply disappeared. Not dramatically, not publicly, they simply ceased to exist, erased from photographs, from records, from memory itself. Then, in 1970, his patience was rewarded. The coup was swift, surgical, brutal. In a single night, the old guard was swept away. By morning, he sat in the palace, and the nation woke to a new master. He was 43 years old, and he would rule for nearly a quarter century. What followed was not governance, it was domination. Absolute, suffocating, paranoid domination. Within weeks, the purges began. Anyone associated with the previous regime, anyone who had ever questioned him, anyone who simply knew too much, faced the firing squad. The prisons filled beyond capacity. The mass graves began to multiply like scars across the nation's landscape. But he was clever. He understood that terror alone creates martyrs, and martyrs inspire resistance. So he wrapped his brutality in the language of nationalism, of security, of protecting the people from enemies, both foreign and domestic. He controlled the newspapers, the radio stations, the television networks. Every word spoken publicly in his nation passed through his censors first. Children learned his name before they learned their alphabet. His portrait portrait hung in every classroom, every government office, every shop. To remove it was treason. To let it gather dust was disrespect. To fail to applaud when his motorcade passed was suspicion. And the courts became his favorite theater of cruelty. He understood that the illusion of justice is more powerful than its absence, so the courts remained open. Judges still wore their robes, trials still occurred, but everyone understood the script. Defense attorneys learned to offer token resistance before inevitably conceding to the prosecution's demands. Judges learned to read the signal in the prosecutor's eyes that indicated which verdict had already been decided in the palace. Political prisoners received elaborate show trials broadcast on national television, where they confessed to impossible conspiracies, where they thanked their captors for revealing their errors, where they begged for the mercy of execution. And he would watch these spectacles from his palace, sipping imported whiskey, occasionally calling the courtroom to offer personal commentary on the proceedings. But it was the disappearances that truly characterized his reign. They came in the night, always in the night. Black vehicles with no license plates, men in civilian clothes who needed no warrants. Families would wake to find a father, a son, a daughter simply gone. No arrest record, no charge, no trial, just absence. Some bodies were eventually found, dumped in rivers or shallow graves bearing marks of unspeakable torture. Most were never found at all. Thousands, tens of thousands. The number grew so large it lost meaning, became mere statistics and reports that would not be compiled until decades later. And through it all, he remained untouchable. When international organizations demanded investigations, his foreign minister politely declined, while his secret police identified and eliminated whoever had leaked information to those organizations. When foreign governments applied pressure, he played nations against each other, selling oil to one, weapons contracts to another, strategic alliance to a third, ensuring that no single power had sufficient interest in his removal. He was brilliant in his monstrosity, calculated in his chaos. By the 1980s, he had been in power for over a decade, and the nation had forgotten what freedom tasted like. An entire generation had grown up knowing only his rule, believing his propaganda, accepting that this was simply how the world worked. The resistance movements that had once fought him were crushed, scattered, silent. But beneath the surface, in whispered conversations, in coded letters, in the eyes of mothers who had lost sons to his dungeon, something else grew. Not hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous, too easily crushed. Something harder, something that could wait. Rage. Cold, patient, eternal rage. The 1990s brought him to the zenith of his power and the beginning of his greatest mistake, believing his own mythology. He had survived coup attempts, assassination plots, international sanctions, and popular uprisings. Each time he emerged stronger, more paranoid, more convinced of his own invincibility. He began to see himself not merely as a ruler, but as a historical force, as inevitable as gravity, as permanent as the mountains. His cult of personality reached absurd heights. State television broadcasts opened not with the national anthem, but with hymns praising him. Universities established departments dedicated to studying his philosophy. Poets were commissioned to write epics celebrating his wisdom. The calendar itself was reformed, with months renamed in his honor. And the wealth, dear God, the wealth. While his people stood in bread lines, while hospitals lacked basic medicines, while schools crumbled and infrastructure decayed, he built palaces, dozens of them, scattered across the country, each more opulent than the last. Solid gold fixtures, marble imported from Italy, chandeliers from France, art stolen from national museums to decorate his private chambers. His family became a criminal enterprise unto themselves. Sons ran protection rackets and smuggling operations. Daughters married into foreign elite families, laundering money through shell corporations. Cousins and nephews held key military and intelligence positions, ensuring loyalty through blood and shared guilt. But the people he had forgotten about, the people whose suffering financed his grandeur, the people whose voices he had silenced for so long that he assumed they had forgotten how to to speak. They were watching, always watching, recording, remembering. In basements and attics, people hid documents, photographs, evidence. Survivors of his torture chambers drew maps of secret prisons, wrote testimonies in code, buried them in metal boxes in their gardens, hoping that someday someone would excavate the truth. Families of the disappeared kept lists, meticulous records of names, dates, last known locations. They passed these lists down to their children, making them memorize the names, ensuring that the dead would not be forgotten, even if their bodies were never found. And as the 20th century drew to a close, as the world changed around him, as technology made information increasingly difficult to control, the cracks began to show. The internet, still primitive, began carrying whispered truths across borders his sensors could not seal. Satellite phones allowed activists to coordinate beyond his security services' ability to monitor. Video cameras became small enough to hide, capturing footage of atrocities that could be smuggled out to international media. But still, the courts did not touch him. Still, no judge dared sign a warrant. Still, prosecutors looked away when his name appeared in investigations, because everyone understood the fundamental truth: laws only matter if someone is willing to enforce them, and no one, absolutely no one, possessed the power to enforce law against him. He had won, completely and totally. Or so it seemed. Time, as we said, is patient. The collapse, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no foreign invasion, no military coup, no popular revolution storming the palace gates. It was quieter than that, more insidious. It began with his body. He had always been robust, vital, energetic despite the decades of stress and paranoia, but time respects no throne. In his late 60s, the first tremors appeared in his hands. His doctors, terrified of delivering bad news, attributed it to stress, to minor nerve issues, to anything but the truth. But the tremors worsened. His memory, once sharp enough to recall a slight from 30 years prior, began to fray. Names escaped him. Dates confused him. During speeches, he would lose his train of thought, staring blankly at crowds while aides scrambled to cover the silence. The sharks began to circle. His sons, who had grown fat on corruption and brutality, began positioning themselves for succession. Alliances shifted. Generals who had served him faithfully for decades started taking meetings with the sons, calculating which horse to back in the coming race. International pressure, which he had deflected for so long, intensified. A new generation of prosecutors at international tribunals began building cases, collecting testimony from refugees and exiles, compiling evidence from the very documentation his victims had so carefully preserved. And then, the uprising. It started in a provincial city, sparked by the self-immolation of a street vendor harassed one too many times by corrupt police. The image spread online, and something broke. Something that had been compressed for decades under the weight of fear suddenly released. Protests erupted, first hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands. His security forces fired on crowds, but instead of fleeing, the crowds grew larger. They tore down his statues, burned his portraits, chanted slogans that would have meant death sentences just months before. He ordered a crackdown, brutal, total, merciless, but his generals hesitated. They saw the writing on walls he refused to read. They calculated their own survival and found it increasingly separate from his. In a final act of defiance against inevitability, he fled, not to face justice, but to preserve his life. In the dead of night, he and his family escaped the palace, fled the capital, sought refuge across borders with whatever allies remained willing to risk harboring him. But exile is not escape. It is merely a slower form of imprisonment. In his exile, he was not the man who had ruled for a quarter century. He was diminished, haunted. The tremors had become convulsions. The memory lapses had become full dementia. He sat in borrowed villas, watching news coverage of his palaces being ransacked, his mass graves being excavated, his victims finally telling their stories to cameras and courts. And the courts. Finally, the courts convened. International tribunals issued warrants. His name, which no judge had dared write for decades, appeared on official indictments, charges of crimes against humanity. Genocide, torture, extrajudicial killings. The list ran for hundreds of pages. His former allies, once terrified of him, now competed to disavow him. Countries that had hosted him for diplomatic visits suddenly discovered they had no record of his presence. Banks that had held his fortunes froze his accounts. Even his own family began to fracture, each member seeking their own deals with prosecutors. But he would never face those courts. Time, having delivered him to the doorstep of justice, had one final verdict to render. His health collapsed completely. The disease that had begun with tremors consumed him. He could no longer speak, no longer recognize the faces of those around him, no longer understand where he was or what he had done. And in this state, in a small bedroom in a foreign land, surrounded not by the opulence he had stolen, but by clinical medical equipment, he died. Some said it was merciful that he never faced trial, that he escaped justice, but they were wrong. Justice came for him every day of those final years. Justice in the form of flesh that betrayed him, of mind that abandoned him, of power that dissolved like morning mist. Justice in the form of exile, of fear, of seeing everything he built collapse while lacking even the cognitive function to fully comprehend the magnitude of his fall. The courts of men never touched him, but time is the court that no one escapes. Time is the judge who hears all cases, the prosecutor who never loses evidence, the executioner who never fails to carry out the sentence. For in the end, we are all equal before time. Kings and peasants, tyrants and saints, the powerful and the powerless. Time comes for us all, strips away our pretensions, reveals our true nature, and delivers us to whatever eternity we have earned. He thought himself above the law. He was never above time. And time always keeps its appointments.